Now we're going to try and make a vase using two techniques that we haven't used now, and we're going to combine those two techniques to create the object that we want. One of the techniques that we're going to use is spline modeling, which basically means using splines or lines in 3ds Max to create the silhouette of our object and the basic shape. And then we're going to use another technique called procedural modeling, which basically means that we use a stack of modifiers to achieve the desired result. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. To maximize my current view, currently it's at the perspective, but I want it to be the front view because we're going to model out the vase from the front. I'm going to press the letter F to go into front view. And in the Create panel, under Geometry, Standard Primitives, I'm going to create a plane. If it's not set already, set the length and width segments to 1 by right-clicking on these arrows right here. So if you have a higher number like 5 or 6 or whatever, just set these to 1 by right-clicking on the arrows. And we're going to drop a reference image onto this plane that we can use as a guide to model out our vase. I've downloaded one image from the internet and I'm going to use as reference. And I'm just going to drag and drop it onto this plane. We need to rescale it because, as you see, the image is currently a bit stretched, so we're just going to go into the scale and just scale it down. Now that our image is placed and that we can use it as reference, what we want is to use the Spline Tool and to create the side of this vase using our spline. In order to avoid accidentally selecting this vase image, I'm going to freeze it. But I also want it to remain visible, because if I freeze it right now, it's just going to be grayed out. So if I just select this, right click, and go to freeze selection, it's going to turn gray and it's going to be totally useless. So I'm going to unfreeze all. I'm going to select it and right click, and in the quad menu, go into Object Properties, and here I can uncheck the Show Frozen in Gray and freeze my object at the same time. So now I can no longer select this object, this vase. I just need it to remain in the background so that I can use it as a reference image. Okay, so far so good. Now let's go ahead and create a spline. I'm going to zoom in and underneath the Create panel, go into the Shapes tab and go into Line. Working with lines in 3ds Max is the same as using the pen tool in any of the vector graphics programs like Corel or Adobe Illustrator. So it's very simple. Click, then drag, click and drag, click and drag in order to create curvy lines. And you can also just click once without dragging out to create corners. But here I want all my lines to be curvy, so just left clicking and dragging, then moving with my middle mouse button downwards, then again left clicking and dragging. Okay, here I want the corner, so I'm just going to click, and again click here and drag. Now, even though this reference image shows a curved bottom, I know that this is purely because it was photographed at a certain angle, but the bottom should be straight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just drag this straight to the middle, left click, and then right click to exit the line tool. Okay, so what we created? Well, we created the spline, which is currently called line 001, and I'm going to rename it and call it vase. What does it look like? Well, let's hide the reference image so we can see the spline that we've created. I'm going to go into my Scene Explorer and just hide my plane. So this is what our line currently looks like. We can now go ahead and do a couple of edits if we wish. So we can adjust any of these shapes, add additional vertices, and reshape the object as much as we want at this state, just to achieve the best result. So I'm going to press the number 1 so that I can actually edit all of these vertices. Now if I select any one of these and right click you can see that I can set all of these to be either a Bezier corner, a Bezier, a corner, or a smooth. What's the difference between all of these? Well, a corner is simply just one point without any curves going out. So this one down here is basically a corner, you know, because it just has a straight line going out from one end and a straight line from the other. And you can see if I right click, it says corner. A Bezier, on the other hand, is a line just like working with Bezier curves that has two handles coming out from it. And if we press the W key, we can go ahead and adjust these handles to adjust the shape. We can also reposition our vertex to reshape our object. So let's just see what are the points where I actually don't like how the shape's looking. Well, this is one of those. I'm going to just select it and move it slightly downward like so. This one's okay-ish. You can just drag it a little bit here. This one's cool, this one I like. I think this one could do a little bit better. I'm just going to drag these handles a little bit back. Okay, this one as well. Now just to show you, I can also switch this one from a Bezier to a simple smooth, which means that I'm not going to have any specific control over the tangents, but it's going to sort of smooth out in and out from this point into all of the other points, which can work well in certain situations. So right now I'm just reshaping it to get a nice overall flow for this face. Perhaps this one could go a little bit inwards, like so. And the last thing I want to do is I want to set the height of this vertex to be the same as this one. Select this vertex, right click on any of these snap buttons, just leave the snap to vertex selected, go into my options, and if it's not turned on, I'm going to turn on enable axis constraints. Now if I turn the snaps toggle on by pressing the letter S, firstly I can lock my axis or turn on my axis constraint by clicking on the y-axis, which means that if I move this vertex, it's only going to move along the y-axis. And nextly, I want to take this vertex and move it upwards, but to select and snap to this one, which basically means that, as you can see, since I've constrained the movement only to my y-axis, even if I drag left or right, my vertex, which is selected, one right here, can only move either up or down, which means I'm only adjusting its height. And I just want to snap to this vertex right here, and now you can see that these two are the same height. I'm going to turn off the snaps toggle by pressing the letter S again. What we want to do now is we want to add a specific modifier to this line. It's going to turn it from a simple line into a 3D shape. And the modifier that we're going to use is, we're going to click on the modifier list and search for the Lathe modifier. So just type in L, it's just popped up, it says Lathe. I'm going to click on that. And as you can see, something strange has happened. And what it's done is it's actually taken my line and it's created a 3D shape by rotating the line around the axis. Now this obviously isn't the result that we want, but the good thing is that we can edit this result because we're working with modifiers, which means we can edit on specific levels of the modifier. So first off, let's press F to go into front view and expand this Lathe modifier and select the axis. Now what we can do is move the axis around which the rotation has happened, and you can see that I can create a vase that's going to be thinner or thicker, but I'm actually going to turn on my reference image. So I'm going to go into my Toggle Scene Explorer, turn on my plane 001, and now I can actually set the shape of this vase to be exactly as it should be according to the reference image. I'm going to turn off my reference image, And now this is the shape that we're left with. Now, what does it mean to actually work procedurally? Well, it implies several different things. Before, when we were doing box modeling, we took a specific 3D object, like a box, and we edited it by converting it into an editable poly and changing its overall shape by moving its polygons, extruding, beveling, and so on. But it's basically just like working on one specific object. But with this one, we're actually working first on the line level, and then to align, we've added a Lathe Modifier. The cool thing is that we can always go back into the line and create edits if we wish, which are going to be updated in the Lathe Modifier. So for instance, if I press F to go into my front view, press G to hide my grid, I can now edit the line, and with that I can quite easily change the shape of this vase. So I'm going to go back into my line, and just to see the changes that are going to occur to the overall shape, I can turn the Show End Results toggle on. I'm going to press 1 on my keyboard to go into my vertex selection tool, and now I can select any of these vertices and move them. And as you can see, as I'm moving my vertices, which are part of the line which determines the shape, I'm actually changing the entire shape, and this change is reflected in the shape that's created by using the Lathe tool. Now, if for one reason or another I'm not satisfied with the way the Lathe tool is performing right now, I can just select it and click the Remove Modifier from the stack. I'm just going to go back into my line tool. This basically means that at each point, this object is basically a series of calculations, and it's not going to be turned into a mesh unless we explicitly tell 3ds Max to do so. This gives us more versatility, but it's more heavy on the computer. So it's good as a workflow, but the end results should definitely be saved as a specific mesh and not as a stack of modifiers for several reasons which we're not going to go into at this point. But we're going to do that a little bit later on. So once again, let's just again add a Lathe Modifier to our object. So press L, click on Lathe, and since we're again not satisfied with the way our lathe looks, I'm just going to turn on my Scene Explorer, and I'm just going to turn on my plane. And now I can expand the lathe, select the axis, and move it so that my object corresponds with my reference image. Let's press F4 to show our edge spaces. Now here we can see how many polygons this vase is currently made up of. And what we can do is we can try and, let's say, work on a low poly level. So create a vase that has the least amount of polygons possible, and then add another modifier which is going to smooth out our result. This can be a good workflow to create the basic shape by blocking it in, by using the least amount of geometry possible, and then adding a modifier that's going to smooth it out. So how can we adjust the level of detail on this vase? First off, we can adjust the level of detail on the line level, and I'm just going to click on the Show End Result. We can change how many sections between vertices we have by going into the interpolation section and then changing the number of steps. The more steps we have, the more horizontal segments we're going to have added. You can see that here in the bottom part, the number of these segments is not changing. It's because we have Optimize turned on, which basically means that it's not going to add segments if there's no specific curvature and if it doesn't require more segments to be added, whereas here, where we have more curvature, we have more added segments. But for the purposes of this, we can turn off Optimize, but lower the number of segments to, let's say, 1. So this is a pretty rough shape, but the cool thing is that it has a smaller number of polygons. We can also reduce the number of polygons on my lathe. So as you can see, here it says segments, and I can increase the number to add more segments in more detail to create a finer model, or I can decrease the number and get a more rough shape. So let's say that at this point I want to leave this at, let's say, 16 segments. This should be enough. The next thing that we want to do to this object is that we want to edit this bottom part right here. The problem is that the polygons right here are not quads, but they're triangles. And not only that, but we also have a hole here which we want to edit out, so we want to fill it. And in order to do that, we would need to select these polygons, delete them, then cap them, the same way we did when we were creating our table using the edit poly. But this currently is not an editable poly. It's basically a line that has a Lathe modifier applied to it. So we could convert all of this to an editable poly, but better yet, we can add an edit poly modifier to it. I'm just going to go into my modifier list, click on E, and search for the edit poly, and here it is. I'm going to left click on it, and an edit poly modifier has been added to this shape, which means that I can now use all of my edit poly tools while still working in a modifier stack, which means here's my line, here's my lathe, and I can edit my object the same way I would had I converted this to an editable poly. So what I want to do here is delete these bottom polygons, and I want to cap them and then slice through them to create quads. In order to do that, I'm going to press 4 on my keyboard, press letter B to go into bottom view, press Q to go into selection, and then just select all of these polygons. I'm just going to check whether I've accidentally selected something else, but it seems I haven't, just to make sure I can change the base color of my base to something which is more, gray will suffice. So okay, only these bottom polygons have been selected. I'm going to press B again and zoom in, and I'm going to hit delete to create the hole. The next thing that I want to do is I want to select this border by pressing the number 3 on my keyboard and selecting it, and I want to close it off or to cap it by clicking on the cap tool in the edit borders section. So now this one is capped. The last thing I want to do is divide this polygon, which is currently a 16-sided polygon, into a series of quads or 4-sided polygons. The way I can do that is by going to my vertex selection mode by pressing the letter 1 and then clicking on my cut tool, which we can find under the edit geometry. So we're going to cut from the top one right here to the bottom one here, right click, cut from the left one to the right one, right click, cut from this one to this one, right click, this one to this one, right click again, cut from here to here, right click, and from here to here, and right click. We've divided our n-gon, our 16-sided n-gon, into 16 quads. We can edit the geometry just a little bit by exiting the cut tool by right clicking and then selecting these 4 vertices by clicking on one, holding down Control, clicking on these 2 as well, pressing R, and then just scale out to create more of a circular shape. And then we can add these 4 vertices to the selection as well, and just scale out a little bit more. And there we go. So we've dealt with our bottom part, and our base is looking pretty good right now, but the problem we have with it is that it currently doesn't have any thickness. I'm going to exit my vertex selection mode and press F4 to hide my edge spaces, and as you can see, if I zoom in, this actually doesn't have any thickness. It's just infinitely thin stripe, and that's not something that we want, because even though this vase may have really thin walls, we want these walls to be double-sided. We want certain thickness to be added to this. So how do we go about adding thickness to this vase? Well, there's a simple modifier that can do that for us, and it's called shell. So we're going to go into the modifier list, press S, and then search for the shell. Press S again. Here it is, shell. So instantly it's going to ask for the thickness of our shell, how thick we want it to be, and we can adjust that by the outer amount settings, or we can just set it to 0 and add an inner shell. I think the outer one is better at this point, so we're just going to add the shell amount of, well, let's just press F4 to see how thick it actually is. So this is without the shell, and let's start adding it. You can see the amount of the shell is going to be added by the thickness of these polygons here. I think this should suffice. So we now have a nice thickness added to this phase of ours. And as you can see, everything is being rendered, so we don't have any dark sides because our polygons were one-sided, only facing outwards. We have also polygons that are facing inwards. And so far, I'm quite satisfied with the way my vase is looking. The only problem is that the good thing is that it's low poly, so it has a low number of polygons and it can be imported into a game engine, and it wouldn't be so hard to reproduce it, to show it, to display it. But if we wanted a more, let's say, a finer detailed vase that wouldn't have such obvious polygonal structure, we can add another modifier to all of this, and usually the one that's going to be used is either a turbo smooth or an open subdiv. Before I go into that, I'm going to press F to go into my front view, and I'm going to create a copy of this object. So I'm just going to press W, hold down Shift, and move this object to the right. I'm going to create a copy, and I'm going to call this vase high poly. And the first one I'm going to rename, I'm going to call it vase underscore low poly. So what I'm going to do with this vase, I'm just going to go into my modifier list, click on O, and open subdiv is going to pop up. And what has happened is that it smoothed out our object. As you can see here, we only have like one line, but here is way smoother. And we can adjust the smoothness even more, but why don't we see more polygons being added? So looking at this, it seems that we basically have the same number of polygons left and right, but that's actually not true. Because our open subdiv is showing us an isoline display, meaning that it's only showing us the most important edges, the edges that we had before applying the open subdiv, and it's not showing us the edges that it's added, the subdivision that it's created. If we turn off the isoline display, you can actually see that our vase on our right has more polygons than our vase on our left, which means that it looks smoother. If we want it to look smoother still, we can ramp up the number of iterations from 1 to 2, and you can see that right now our vase is looking pretty smooth, whereas the one on the left has really visible corners, and it's, you can see that it's created out of segments, and with this one it looks really smooth and really round. There is one problem with this vase, however, and if we look in the front view, the problem that I see here is that its bottom is actually too curved, and I think that this one would be sort of unstable had we created this in real life. So what we want to do is we actually want to see where this curvature actually occurred. I'm going to press F to go into my front view and press F4 to see my edge faces. Now I'm going to turn off these modifiers one by one just to see where this curvature occurred. So we had it in the shell modifier, but not at the added poly level, which means we need to add certain changes to our shell modifier so that we don't have this curvature at the bottom. So we would actually need to set all of these bottom polygons to be the same height, but we cannot do that with the shell modifier. What we need to do actually is to add an edit poly modifier on top of the shell modifier, select these vertices, and then just scale them so that they're all the same height. The way we're going to do that is with the shell modifier selected, just go ahead here and select the edit poly by pressing E and going to edit poly. And now we need to select all of these vertices down here, and one way to do that is to press the letter 4 to go into my polygon selection tool. So I can just select all of these by selecting the 4 polygons in the middle by clicking on one, holding down Control, and clicking on these 2 as well. And then just clicking row 2 times to select all of these polygons at the bottom. Now, because I want to scale the vertices of these polygons to set them to be the same height, I want to Control click on the vertex selection tool, go into my front view by pressing the letter F, pressing R to go into my select and scale tool, and by scaling these vertices along the y-axis, I'm actually going to set all of them to be the same height. So I just do this a couple of times consecutively, and their height should be set to be the same. The only thing I need to do right now is I need to lower them just a little bit, because it may occur that with the rescaling of these vertices we may have just flattened out and perhaps even intersected the planes on the inside of our shell and the ones on the outside. So I just want to press the letter W and move these vertices a little bit down, something like this. I'm going to go out of my vertex selection by pressing 1 and just see what it all looks like with the open subdiv. So you can see that right now this bottom part, even though it has a sort of curvature right here, the bottom part right here is flat, which means that this phase would be stable. And you can see the difference in the result if I turn off my edit poly. You can see that I have more curvature down here, whereas when I turn it on, all of this remains flat. I only have curvature in this part right here. So let's see the difference between these two results by pressing F4 and deselecting any object. So you can see that the one on the left, it's more optimized because it has less polygons, but the one on the right is more smooth. So if we just wanted an image not to import this into a game engine, the base on our right would be a better solution. Whereas if we wanted to import this model into a game engine and then work with it, a low poly model would definitely be a better solution, because it would be easier on our computer and the game would just run faster. So okay, now we have these two versions, but if we're going to export this as a specific model, or even save it so that we can work on it later on, or perhaps just send it to another person who's going to work on that, it's not a good idea to send models around as stacks of modifiers, because you never know whether the person who's going to be working on that model is going to be using the same version of the program or even the same program as you. And it might occur that if you send them a max file that has a stack of modifiers inside of it, also what we want to do is we just want to convert this high poly model with all of these modifiers into a single editable poly. So I'm not going to do that this specific object. I'm just going to hold down Shift and drag it to the right to create another copy, and I'm going to call this phase high poly collapsed. And what I want to do is I just want to right click on the open subdiv and click on collapse all. I'm going to click yes. And now my object is just an editable poly, whereas this one is again one which I can edit through its different phases and different stages, from the line through to the lathe the edit poly, the shell, then another edit poly, which just evened out the height of these vertices right here, and the open subdiv, which created a smoother result. And there we have it.